Welcome to Wars and Dusk. Tonight, we journey to the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartan warriors received the order they always knew would come, and chose to stand anyway. If history's greatest conflicts are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the past carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let your shoulders settle. Let your breathing slow. There is nowhere you need to be right now, and nothing that needs your attention tonight except this story, a story that is more than 2,500 years old, and yet somehow still feels present, still feels close, as though it happened in a landscape you could walk through if you simply closed your eyes and let yourself go there. We are going to a narrow pass on the eastern coast of Greece. A place where the mountains press so close to the sea that an army of hundreds of thousands could be slowed to a trickle. A place where the wind comes off the water at night, cool and salt-edged, and where the stars above are very bright and very far away. It is the summer of 480 BCE. The Persian Empire, the largest empire the world has yet seen, is moving. A king named Xerxes has crossed from Asia into Europe with a force so enormous that ancient sources described it as darkening the sky with arrows, as drinking rivers dry. Whether or not those numbers are exact, the reality is undeniable. A civilization-ending force is moving through Greece. And somewhere, in a camp by that narrow pass, 300 Spartan warriors are sitting with a truth they have quietly accepted. They are not going home. This is their story. And it is also the story of the world they were trying to protect. Let yourself settle in now. Let the weight of the day release. There is only this moment, and this ancient firelight, and the slow breathing of warriors who knew exactly what the dawn would bring. Part 1: The World Before the Storm, the Persian Empire and the Greek World. Before we can understand 300 men choosing to remain at a pass they knew they could not hold, we need to understand the world that produced both the army that was coming and the men who stood in its path. The Persian Empire in 480 BCE was not simply a large kingdom. It was a different category of thing entirely from anything the Greeks had encountered before. The empire stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to the shores of the Aegean in the west. It encompassed what we would today call Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Egypt, parts of Central Asia, and the western fringes of India. Dozens of languages were spoken within its borders. Dozens of peoples, with their own customs and religions and ways of life, lived under the authority of the great king in Persepolis. The Persian kings did not see themselves merely as rulers of a kingdom. They understood themselves as rulers of the known world, the axis around which civilization itself turned. The great King Darius I, who had built the empire to its height before his son Xerxes inherited it, had inscribed on monuments his belief that Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of the Persian faith, had given him the earth, that his duty was to extend order and civilization to its farthest corners. This was not just propaganda. It was a genuine cosmological framework. And within that framework, the small, fractious, often quarrelsome city-states of Greece were simply an anomaly. A loose end. A collection of polis, independent city-states, that had, a decade earlier, committed what Persia considered an act of extraordinary impudence. In 499 BCE, the Greek cities of Ionia, the western coast of what is now Turkey, had risen in revolt against Persian rule. The Ionian Revolt, as it came to be called, lasted 6 years before being suppressed. But during that revolt, the Athenians and the Eretrians had sent ships and soldiers to help the rebels burn the Persian provincial capital of Sardis. To Darius, this was an insult that could not pass unanswered. He sent a campaign in 490 BCE. The Persians landed at Marathon on the northeastern coast of Attica and were met, astonishingly, by the Athenians and their Plataean allies in a battle that defied all expectation. The Athenians, fighting without the Spartans who had been delayed by a religious festival, routed a Persian force that should by every calculation have overwhelmed them. The Battle of Marathon became one of the defining myths of Athenian identity. The men who fought there were called the Marathonomachoi, the marathon fighters, and they were honored for the rest of their lives as something more than ordinary soldiers. The city had stood against the empire and won. But Darius was not finished. He was preparing a second, larger campaign when he died in 486 BCE, and the obligation of revenge passed to his son Xerxes. Xerxes was a complex figure, one the Greek sources were not kind to, partly because Greeks always cast their enemies in the worst possible light. But he was not simply a tyrant or a fool. He was a king who understood the symbolic weight of what he was doing. Crushing Greece would not just be a military victory. It would be a statement to the entire empire and to the world beyond it. It would prove that nothing could resist the will of the great king. He spent years preparing. He built a canal through the peninsula at Mount Athos to avoid the storms that had wrecked previous Persian fleets. He constructed 2 bridges of boats across the Hellespont, the strait between Asia and Europe, so his army could cross without using ships. Ancient sources, primarily Herodotus, tell us that when storms destroyed the first bridges, Xerxes ordered the sea itself to be whipped 300 times and chains thrown into it as a symbolic punishment. Whether this is literally true or a later embellishment, it tells us something real about how the Greeks perceived this king, as a man whose pride had reached a kind of metaphysical arrogance. The size of Xerxes' army remains a subject of scholarly debate. Herodotus gave a figure of over 2 million fighting men, which modern historians regard as wildly inflated, a product of ancient arithmetic that multiplied contingent figures without accounting for duplication, logistical impossibility, and rhetorical amplification. Modern estimates range from roughly 100,000 to perhaps 300,000 soldiers and sailors combined, with the actual fighting land force perhaps in the range of 80,000 to 150,000. Even the lowest credible estimate was overwhelming by Greek standards. The Greek world, by contrast, was fragmented. There were hundreds of city-states, each with its own government, its own army, its own priorities. Many of them, particularly in northern and central Greece, would simply submit to Persia, a process called Medizing, after the Medes, the Persian allied people whose name Greeks often used for the Persians themselves. These cities were not cowards. They were making rational calculations. Submission meant survival. Resistance meant destruction. But not all of Greece would submit. Athens and Sparta, in particular, had already made their positions clear. When Persian heralds arrived in 491 BCE demanding earth and water, the traditional tokens of submission, Athens threw theirs into a pit and Sparta threw theirs into a well. The message was unmistakable. These 2 cities could not have been more different. Athens was a democracy, chaotic, argumentative, commercially vibrant, home to philosophers and merchants and playwrights. Sparta was something else entirely. something the rest of the Greek world admired, feared, and did not entirely understand. To understand the 300 men at Thermopylae, we must understand what Sparta was, and what it had made of its citizens. Part 2, Sparta, the city that made warriors its only product. There is a moment in the life of every Spartan male child that tells you almost everything you need to know about the civilization that produced the 300. At birth, each male infant was brought before a council of Spartan elders. The child was examined. If it was judged strong and healthy, it was returned to its parents. If it was judged weak or deformed, it was exposed, left on the slopes of a mountain called Apothetai, to die. This was not cruelty for its own sake, in the Spartan understanding. It was the first step in a process of selection that would continue for the rest of the child's life. The Spartan system of education was called the agoge, and it began in earnest at age 7, when male children were taken from their families and placed in groups called agelai, herds, where they would live, sleep, train, and compete together for the next 13 years. The agoge was not schooling in any recognizable modern sense. It was a systematic dismantling of childhood comfort and a rebuilding of the self around endurance, discipline, and collective identity. Boys were deliberately underfed, with the expectation that they would steal additional food, but they were severely punished if they were caught, not for the stealing, but for the failure of craft. They slept on reeds they cut themselves from the river Eurotas. They went without shoes in summer and winter alike. They were subjected to ritual beatings at the altar of Artemis Orthia, a ceremony that in later centuries became a kind of public spectacle, with young men competing to endure more pain than their peers, sometimes dying in the process. But the agoge was not only about pain and endurance. It was also about loyalty. The bonds formed between boys and an agelai were expected to last a lifetime. The Spartan army fought in formations where every man beside you was someone you had slept beside and bled beside since childhood. This created a cohesion, a mutual dependence and trust, that was qualitatively different from the armies of other Greek states. At 20, a Spartan male who had successfully completed the agoge would attempt to be elected into a mess, a sicyon, a dining group of approximately 15 men who would eat together every night for the rest of their lives. A single blackball from any member of the group could exclude a candidate. Exclusion meant loss of full citizen status. The stakes of social belonging were absolute. Spartan warriors would continue to live in barracks and eat in their mess until the age of 30, even if they were married. The family was real, but secondary. The unit, the mess, the regiment, the army, was primary. At 30, a Spartan male became a full citizen, a Spartiate. He was given a kleros, a plot of land, worked by helots, the enslaved agricultural population who formed the economic foundation of Spartan society. The helots outnumbered the Spartans enormously. Ancient estimates suggest ratios of 7 or 10 to 1, and managing this restive, permanently subjugated population was a constant preoccupation of the Spartan state. Each year, Sparta formally declared war on the helots, which allowed Spartiates to kill helots without religious pollution. The Cryptia, a secret police operation in which young Spartan warriors were sent to live in the countryside and kill potentially troublesome helots, was part of a system of organized terror designed to prevent the uprising that Sparta always feared. This context matters because it shaped what Sparta valued and what it feared. Sparta was a militarized society not simply because it chose to glorify war, but because it needed a warrior class to maintain control over a population that had every reason to revolt. The agoge, the mess, the barracks, all of it was in service of producing men who could fight, and fight well, and keep fighting when every rational instinct said to stop. Spartan women, too, occupied an unusual position in the Greek world. Where Athenian women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, Spartan women exercised, competed, and were expected to be physically strong. This was partly practical. Strong mothers produced strong children, but it also reflected a cultural attitude toward the feminine that other Greeks found distinctly strange. There is a famous exchange attributed to a Spartan woman, asked why Spartan women were the only women in Greece who ruled their men. Her reply, "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." The religion and culture of Sparta reinforced this identity at every turn. The patron deity of Sparta was not Ares, the god of war, despite what you might expect. It was Apollo, god of reason, order, and discipline. And it was Apollo's oracle at Delphi that gave Sparta much of its moral and strategic guidance. We will return to this oracle, because it played a crucial role in the decisions that led 300 men to Thermopylae. By 480 BCE, Sparta was regarded throughout Greece as the dominant land power. No army in the Greek world trained harder, fought longer, or maintained greater tactical discipline. The Spartans did not fight with the wild courage of warriors who have abandoned caution. They fought with something more unsettling, absolute professionalism. They moved to battle to music, not to inflame their passions, but to regulate their pace and their breathing. They wore their hair long as a mark of distinction. They polished their shields and their armor before battle, not out of vanity, but because, in Spartan theology, a soldier going into battle should look his finest, as one going to a sacred ceremony. And the king of Sparta, for Sparta unusually had two kings simultaneously, from two royal houses, held a specific role in battle. He was not a general sitting safely behind the lines. He was the point of the spear, fighting in the front rank, with the royal bodyguard around him. The Spartan king led from the front, always. In 480 BCE, one of Sparta's two kings was Leonidas. And it is Leonidas who will stand at the center of everything that follows. Part 3, Leonidas, the king who chose his 300. We know relatively little about Leonidas before Thermopylae. He was not young when he came to the throne, perhaps in his late 40s or 50s. He had come to kingship through an accident of succession rather than direct inheritance. His older brothers Cleomenes and Dorius had both died under circumstances that the ancient sources describe with varying levels of suspicious detail. Cleomenes, who had been perhaps the most dominant Spartan king of his generation, died in what Herodotus describes as madness, reportedly slashing himself with a knife until he died. Whether this was suicide, mental illness, or something more sinister has been debated ever since. Leonidas inherited a Sparta that was fully aware of what was coming from the east. Persian scouts had already reached Greek territory. Persian heralds had traveled through the Greek world demanding submission. The shape of the threat was understood, even if its full scale was not yet visible. What was Leonidas like? The ancient sources give us fragments. He was said to be measured in speech, a virtue in Spartan culture, where the highest eloquence was brevity. He was said to be beloved by his soldiers, not in the way that popular generals are loved, with cheering and celebration, but with the deeper, quieter loyalty that forms between men who know their commander will not spend their lives lightly. He was married to Gorgo, daughter of his predecessor Cleomenes, which made the dynastic situation somewhat complex, but also meant that Leonidas had married into the very heart of Spartan royal power. Gorgo is one of the most remarkable women in ancient Greek history. She appears in Herodotus 3 times, and each time she is the cleverest person in the room. As a child, when the Spartan regent Cleomenes was receiving an advisor who was trying to bribe him with increasingly large offers of silver, the young Gorgo, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, said quietly, "Father, you had better get up and go away, or this stranger will corrupt you." The advisor was escorted out. Later, when a blank wax tablet arrived in Sparta from a Greek exile in Persia, apparently meaningless, and baffling the Spartan authorities, it was Gorgo who suggested scraping off the wax. Underneath was the message, inscribed on the wooden backing, warning Sparta of Xerxes' planned invasion. Ancient sources present this as historical fact. Modern scholars debate its literal truth, but the fact that the story was preserved about Gorgo at all tells us something about how she was regarded. When Leonidas left for Thermopylae, Gorgo is said to have asked him what she should do while he was gone. His reported answer, "Marry a good man and have good children." The selection of the 300 men who would accompany Leonidas to Thermopylae was not random. This was not a draft, not a levy. These men were specifically chosen, and the criteria for selection, as preserved by ancient sources and their later commentators, is striking. Leonidas chose men who had living sons. Let that settle for a moment. He did not choose the youngest and strongest. He did not choose the most celebrated warriors. He chose men who had already produced children, men whose family lines would continue after them. This was not a coincidence, and it was not sentimental. It was a deliberate acknowledgement, at the very moment of selection, that these men were not expected to return. The 300 were not going to Thermopylae to hold the pass indefinitely. They were not going with the expectation of reinforcement or relief. They were going, in the deepest Spartan understanding, as a sacrifice made willingly, with eyes open, in service of something larger than their own survival. There is a detail here that we should sit with carefully, because it transforms how we understand everything that follows. The 300 Spartans at Thermopylae are often described as men who didn't know they would die there. This is not quite right. They were men who knew, who had been told, through the selection criteria itself, if through no other means, that their deaths were probable. And they went anyway. This was not recklessness. This was not the kind of passionate, impulsive courage that throws itself at an enemy in a moment of heat. This was something colder, more considered, and in many ways more profound. These men had time to think about it. They had time to say goodbye. They had time to sit with the knowledge of what was coming and to choose it anyway. The ancient Spartan custom at the departure of soldiers going to war was that women would hand them their shields with the words, "With it or on it." Return with your shield, meaning you have not fled, or be carried home on it. In Spartan ethics, to throw away your shield in flight was the ultimate disgrace, because a shield protected the man standing next to you before it protected yourself. To abandon your shield was to abandon your brother. It was a form of treachery. Leonidas would have received his shield from Gorgo, or placed it on his own arm in her presence, with both of them understanding fully what was probably coming. We do not know what they said to each other at that parting. The ancient sources don't record it. But we can sit with the silence of that moment and understand that it was its own kind of eloquence. Part 4: The Pass, Thermopylae and Why Geography Changed History. To understand why Thermopylae mattered, and why 300 men there could slow an army of tens of thousands, we need to understand the geography. Because the geography is the entire explanation, and it is one of the most remarkable instances in all of military history of how a landscape can become a weapon. Thermopylae means hot gates in Greek. The name comes from the sulfurous hot springs that bubbled from the cliffs above the narrow passage, whose steam could be seen and smelled from a considerable distance. In 480 BCE, the pass was bordered on one side by steep, forested mountains and on the other side by the sea, or at least by shallow, marshy ground that extended to the water's edge. The actual passage between the base of the cliffs and the coastal marshes was, at its narrowest point, only wide enough for a single cart. This single fact changed the entire military equation. In open ground, a Persian army of even the most conservative modern estimate, say 80,000 soldiers, could simply wrap around a Greek force and overwhelm it. Numbers were decisive in open terrain. The Persian military system included cavalry, archers, and elite infantry, and it was designed for the kind of large-scale maneuvering that could exploit numerical superiority. But in a narrow pass, maneuvering becomes impossible. Cavalry cannot be deployed effectively when the front is only wide enough for a few men to stand abreast. Archers can still operate, but if the defending infantry can hold the line, if the men at the front do not break, then the rear ranks cannot reach the battle. The enemy's numerical advantage becomes irrelevant. You can only fight as many men as the width of the pass allows. Greek hoplite warfare was particularly well suited to this kind of fighting. A hoplite, a heavy infantryman, fought with a large round shield, a long spear, and short sword for close combat. The tactical formation was the phalanx, a tight block of men, shields overlapping, spears extending forward in overlapping rows. The front rank's shields protected both themselves and the lower bodies of the men behind them. The spears created a bristling hedge of iron points that was extraordinarily difficult to penetrate frontally. The strength of the phalanx was the strength of the group. A single hoplite in isolation was not particularly difficult to defeat. But a phalanx of even moderate size was a different kind of thing, a collective organism, built for exactly the environment of Thermopylae, where there was no room to maneuver around it. The Spartans were not simply hoplites, however. They were the finest hoplite fighters in the world. Their training had prepared them for the specific reality of phalanx combat in a way that no other Greek city-state had managed to replicate. They knew when to press forward and when to hold ground. They knew how to rotate men out of the front rank, exhausted fighters stepping back to rest while fresh men moved up, a maneuver requiring extraordinary discipline that most armies could not sustain in the heat of actual battle. They knew how to feign retreat, drawing an enemy forward out of formation, and then turn and counterattack. This last technique would prove particularly devastating at Thermopylae, and the ancient sources describe the Persians being baffled by it. They interpreted what was a calculated tactical withdrawal as actual flight, surged forward in pursuit, and found themselves suddenly facing a Spartan line that had turned and was driving into them with the full force of a disciplined phalanx. There is also the wall. At the narrowest point of the pass, there had once been a wall built by the Phocians, a local Greek people, to defend their territory. By 480 BCE, it had fallen into disrepair, but it was still identifiable as a defensive structure, and one of the first things the Greek forces did when they arrived at Thermopylae was begin repairing and reinforcing it. This wall would serve as both a physical barrier and a psychological anchor point, a fixed line behind which the Greeks could fall back, regroup, and prepare for the next assault. The Greek force at Thermopylae was not, it is important to understand, composed only of Spartans. Leonidas brought his 300 Spartiates, but he also brought approximately 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and contingents from Arcadia, Corinth, Phlius, and Mycenae, among others. The total Greek force at the pass has been variously estimated by ancient sources at between 5,000 and 7,000 men. The Thespians deserve particular mention here, because their story has been somewhat overshadowed by the fame of the Spartans. The Thespians were soldiers from the small city of Thespii, a community that knew perfectly well that their city lay directly in the path of the Persian advance. They had no great walls, no naval power, no strategic depth. If Persia passed Thermopylae, Thespii would be destroyed. And it was. The city was burned to the ground by Xerxes' army during the campaign. The Thespians who stayed at Thermopylae until the end, and all 700 of them did, were defending their homeland in the most literal possible sense, with no hope and no illusions. The Thebans are a more complicated case. Thebes was a powerful city in central Greece, and there is historical evidence suggesting that the Theban government was at least considering submission to Persia. The 400 Thebans at Thermopylae may have been there partly as hostages, held by Leonidas as assurance of Theban loyalty, or at least as a way of keeping Theban options limited. When the final battle came, the Thebans reportedly surrendered rather than fight to the death, claiming they had been forced to be there against their will. Herodotus tells all of this with his characteristic measured fairness, trying to record what he knows while acknowledging what is contested. And the picture he gives us is of a Greek alliance at Thermopylae that was united less by shared ideology than by shared necessity, a coalition of peoples who, for different reasons and with different degrees of commitment, had decided that this narrow pass on the eastern coast of Greece was where they would make their stand. Part 5: The Oracle and the Weight of Prophecy. Before any soldier reached Thermopylae, before any shield was raised or spear was leveled, there was the matter of the oracle. The oracle at Delphi was, in the Greek world, something that defies simple modern categorization. It was not merely a religious institution, though it was deeply religious. It was not merely a political tool, though it functioned politically. It was a place where the boundary between the human world and the divine world was considered thinner than elsewhere, where the god Apollo spoke through a human intermediary, the Pythia, a priestess who sat over a chasm in the rock of Mount Parnassus and uttered, in a state of altered consciousness, words that were then interpreted and recorded by attending priests. The process of consultation was elaborate. City-states and individuals had to earn the right to consult through fees, gifts, and proper ritual preparation. The oracle's answers were famously ambiguous, phrased in a way that could be interpreted multiple ways, giving the oracle a kind of retrospective infallibility. Whatever happened, the oracle's words could be read as having predicted it. When the Athenians consulted Delphi about the Persian threat, the oracle gave them a response that shook the delegation to its foundations. The oracle spoke of destruction, of fire and blood, of temples burning and walls falling. It told the Athenians that nothing could stop what was coming, that they should flee to the ends of the earth. When the shaken Athenian envoys asked a second time, the oracle spoke of a wooden wall, a wall that would not fail, that would protect the Athenians and their children. This second response was itself the subject of fierce debate. Did wooden wall mean the old stockade on the Acropolis? Or did it mean the fleet, the wooden ships? It was the statesman Themistocles who argued, successfully, that the wooden wall was the Athenian navy, and that argument eventually led to the Battle of Salamis, which we will touch on later. But it is the Spartan oracle that most concerns us now. When Sparta consulted Delphi about the Persian invasion, the oracle gave a response that has echoed down through 25 centuries. The oracle said, in essence, that one of two things must happen: either Sparta itself would be destroyed, or a Spartan king must die. The ancient sources preserve this oracle in poetic form, and while the exact wording varies across different manuscript traditions, the core message is consistent. Sparta would be devastated, its people scattered, its city burned, unless a Spartan king was killed in its defense. There is enormous scholarly debate about when exactly Leonidas became aware of this oracle: before his departure, during the march north, or perhaps even during the battle itself when it became clear that the pass was lost. There are those who argue that Leonidas knew from the beginning that his selection of men with living sons was a direct response to this oracle, that everything about his departure from Sparta was shaped by this foreknowledge. Others argue more cautiously that the oracle may have been composed or refined after the fact, that ancient oracles were frequently reworded or reinterpreted in the light of subsequent events, and that we cannot be certain the oracle was delivered in this specific form before Thermopylae. But here is what we can say with reasonable confidence: in the culture of 480 BC Sparta, oracles from Delphi were taken with absolute seriousness. A Spartan king who received, or who knew of, an oracle suggesting his death was required to protect his city would not have found it incomprehensible. He would have understood it as a divine assignment, terrible, final, but comprehensible within the framework of his entire world. The Spartans of the classical period had a complex relationship with the idea of death in battle. They did not seek death. They did not romanticize it in the way that some later martial cultures have done. The Spartan view was more austere. Death in battle was a natural and appropriate end for a warrior, not because death was glorious, but because the alternative, flight, surrender, abandonment of one's post, was worse. There was no comfortable afterlife promised to the Spartan warrior who died bravely. There was only the certainty that he had not disgraced himself. The famous Spartan epitaph, often attributed to Simonides, written for the dead of Thermopylae, captures this with brutal economy: "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. Not we died for glory. Not we sacrificed ourselves for freedom. We were obedient to our laws." There is something almost administrative in that phrasing, and I think that is exactly the point. The Spartans did not need to dress up their deaths in the language of heroism. The act itself was sufficient. The law required it. They obeyed. This is the weight that Leonidas carried as he led his 300 north. Not the weight of uncertainty about whether he might die, but the weight of something closer to certainty, and the task of carrying that weight without letting it become paralysis, without letting it leach into the men around him and poison their resolve. How he managed that is, in its way, one of the most extraordinary leadership achievements in the ancient world. Part 6: The March North and the Arrival at the Pass. The march from Sparta to Thermopylae was approximately 200 miles, through terrain that ranged from the flat agricultural plains of the Peloponnese to the rocky mountain passes of central Greece. For a Spartan army, this was not an unusual distance. Spartan soldiers were trained to march as well as fight, and could cover ground at a pace that other Greek forces found remarkable. The march north took place in late summer, in the heat of the Greek sun. The army moved at the regulated pace that Spartan training instilled, not rushing, not dawdling, maintaining the discipline of movement that would later translate to the discipline of the battle line. They would have moved through towns and villages that were themselves in various stages of preparation for what was coming, some fortifying, some evacuating, some submitting. The landscape itself was a map of Greek uncertainty. As the Greek force assembled at Thermopylae, contingents arriving from different cities, setting up camps, organizing the defensive position, there must have been a process of coordination that required considerable political and military skill from Leonidas. He was the chosen commander of the allied force, but commanding allies who were theoretically equals required a different kind of authority than commanding Spartans. You could not simply order an Arcadian or a Corinthian to do something in the way you could a Spartan soldier. You had to persuade, or at least create conditions in which persuasion was unnecessary because the logic of the situation was obvious. Leonidas managed this with what the sources describe as quiet authority. He did not make speeches. He did not lecture his allies about Spartan virtue or Spartan methods. He organized the position, assigned sectors, and began the work of turning a narrow coastal pass into the most defensible ground in Greece. The Persian army had crossed the Hellespont and moved through Thrace and Macedonia, territories that had already submitted. They had paused at the beach of Doriscos for what Herodotus describes as a grand review of the entire force, with Xerxes seated on a throne on a hillside watching his army march past, an event so large it reportedly took 7 days to complete. Whether or not this is exact, it conveys the scale of what was approaching. Xerxes sent forward a scout cavalry unit to reconnoiter the Greek position at Thermopylae. What the scouts reported back to the Persian king is described by Herodotus in a passage that is one of the most vivid in all of ancient literature. The scouts reported that the Spartans were exercising. Some were doing physical training. Others were combing their long hair. The Persians found this incomprehensible, or at least, the Persian king did. Xerxes reportedly asked an advisor, a Greek exile named Demaratus who had fled Sparta after being deposed from his own Spartan kingship, what on earth these men were doing. Demaratus gave an answer that we should hear carefully, because it encapsulates a cultural divide as large as the one between East and West in 480 BCE. Demaratus told Xerxes that the Spartans were preparing for battle. That it was the custom of Spartan warriors, before combat, to dress their hair. He told Xerxes that these men would fight with extraordinary skill and courage, that they were free men but not wholly free, because their law was their master, and it commanded them to stand and die rather than flee. He told Xerxes that attacking them at Thermopylae would be, whatever the numerical odds, an extremely costly enterprise. Xerxes laughed. Herodotus tells us he found the whole thing amusing. And then he waited 4 days before attacking, hoping perhaps that the small Greek force would see reason and withdraw. They did not. Those 4 days must have been a particular kind of waiting. On the Greek side, men would have continued training, maintaining their equipment, eating their controlled rations, sleeping when they could. Scouts on the higher ground would have been reporting back on the size and movement of the Persian force accumulating to the north. And gradually, through those 4 days, the scale of what was coming would have become impossible to deny. We do not know exactly what was said between Leonidas and his officers during those 4 days. We do not have the conversations in the mess tents, the words exchanged between men who had eaten together and trained together for decades. We have only what the later sources chose to preserve, the anecdotes, the reported exchanges, the fragments of speeches. But we know that they did not leave. And that, in the end, tells us more than any speech could. Part 7, the first 2 days, the pass holds. When Xerxes finally ordered the assault, on the 5th day after the Greek force arrived at the pass, the scale of what he committed was itself an indication of how much he had underestimated what he was facing. He sent the Medes first, the contingent from the ancient territory of Media, a people with a long military tradition who formed a significant part of the Persian imperial army. They were experienced soldiers, well equipped, and accustomed to facing Greek-style infantry. They broke. Not in the first moments, the fighting was hard and prolonged, but the Medes could not break through the Greek line. The phalanx at the narrowest point of the pass held, and the Spartan techniques, the rotation of fighting men, the feigned retreat followed by sudden reversal, cost the Medes heavily. Herodotus records that Xerxes, watching from his throne on a high place above the battlefield, rose 3 times in agitation as he watched his soldiers falling. He then sent in the Immortals. The Immortals were the elite corps of the Persian army, a unit always kept at exactly 10,000 men, so that whenever a member was killed or incapacitated, he was immediately replaced. The name itself was designed to convey a kind of divine inevitability. This force could not be diminished, could not be worn down, would always be 10,000 strong. They were the finest fighters Persia had, and Xerxes sent them in expecting them to sweep the pass clean. The Immortals also failed to break through. The reason was the same as it had been for the Medes. The geography negated their advantages. Persian tactics relied on mobility, on archery from range, on cavalry operations that could outflank and envelop an enemy. None of these options were available in the pass. The Immortals, like the Medes before them, were forced into exactly the kind of close, grinding, heavily armored frontal combat in which the Spartans had no equal. The Persian forces also faced a significant disadvantage in their equipment. Persian infantry typically carried shorter spears than Greek hoplites, and their shields, wicker-framed and lighter, provided less protection in the kind of press of bodies that developed when 2 lines collided at close range. The Greek aspes, the large round bronze-fronted shield, and the long Daru spear gave the hoplite a reach and protection that the Persian infantrymen, however brave, could not easily overcome. The first day ended with the pass still in Greek hands and Persian casualties by any reasonable estimate running into the hundreds, perhaps thousands. The second day was much the same. Xerxes tried different contingents, different approaches, hoping to find a weakness in the Greek line. He found none. The Greeks rotated their contingents through the fighting, allowing different city-state units to hold the line while others rested. The Spartans were deployed most often at the critical moments, when Persian pressure was greatest, but all of the Greek contingents, including the Thespians, fought with what the sources describe as remarkable discipline and effectiveness. In the Persian camp on the evening of the second day, there must have been a profound reassessment happening. The greatest army the world had seen was being stopped by a few thousand men in a narrow pass. Logistics were a pressing concern. Feeding and supplying an army of this size required an enormous infrastructure, and every day spent at Thermopylae was a day when that supply chain was under strain. Morale, too. Persian soldiers who had expected a swift advance to Athens were instead being asked to watch their comrades die in a pass that seemed to have no bottom. Xerxes needed a different approach. And the approach came to him that evening, in the form of a man named Ephialtes. Ephialtes was a local Greek, a man from the region of Malis, the territory immediately surrounding Thermopylae. He knew the area intimately. And he knew something the Greek defenders had hoped Xerxes would not discover. There was a path through the mountains that went around the pass. The path was called the Anapeia. It wound through the forested mountain above the pass, navigable on foot though not by horses or carts, and it came out behind the Greek position. An army that traversed the Anapeia in sufficient strength could descend behind the defenders at Thermopylae and attack from both sides simultaneously. The pass had been flanked. And when Leonidas received the news, brought by scouts in the very early hours of the morning before the third day, the entire military and human situation changed. Part 8, The Night the 300 Knew. There is a moment that gives this entire story its name, and it came in the dark hours before dawn on the third day at Thermopylae. The Greek position included a small detachment of Phocian soldiers, about 1,000 men, posted on the upper portion of the Anapeia path specifically to guard against exactly this kind of flanking movement. They were not Spartans. They were local men, soldiers of a middling Greek state who had volunteered for a duty that was understood to be important but not expected to be critical. The assumption, perhaps, was that the Persians did not know about the path. The Persians did know. Ephialtes had told them, and Xerxes had immediately dispatched the immortals under a commander named Hydarnes to traverse the Anapeia under cover of darkness. The immortals moved through the mountain forest all night. The path was difficult, the forests of Mount Ida were dense, the footing uneven, the darkness absolute except for whatever light they carried. But 10,000 disciplined soldiers who have been given a clear objective and are motivated by the prospect of ending a battle that has stalled for 2 days are capable of remarkable things. They were heard. At dawn, the Phocian soldiers guarding the upper path heard the sound of men moving through leaves, a whisper, then a rustle, then the unmistakable sound of 10,000 pairs of feet. They looked toward the east and saw, in the first pale gray of morning light, the immortals emerging from the tree line. The Phocians retreated to a nearby hilltop and prepared to fight. The immortals, to their great credit in terms of time efficiency, did not stop to engage them. They had what Herodotus describes as a brief, sharp exchange of arrows, and then the immortals moved past, leaving the Phocians intact but bypassed, continuing their descent toward the rear of the Greek position in the pass below. A runner reached Leonidas with the news while the night was still dark, though fading toward dawn. Leonidas called a council. What was said in that council we cannot know with certainty. Herodotus describes the outcome without recording the deliberations. But the outcome itself is one of the most extraordinary decisions in military history, and it speaks with remarkable clarity to what kind of man Leonidas was, and what kind of men he had with him. Leonidas dismissed most of the allied Greek contingents. He sent them south, back through the pass, out of the trap that the pass was about to become. The Arcadians, the Corinthians, the soldiers from Phlius and Mycenae, they were given the order to withdraw. Their service had been honorable. Their lives were still worth saving. The Thespians, all 700 of them, refused to go. Their commander, a man named Demophilus, reportedly told Leonidas that it would be a disgrace to leave a position they had come to hold, and that since their city lay behind them and would be destroyed regardless of what happened here, they chose to die at Thermopylae rather than retreat. Herodotus is at pains to make clear that this was a voluntary choice, that the Thespians were not ordered to stay, that they made the decision for their own reasons, out of their own sense of honor and perhaps their own calculation that there was no better alternative. The Thebans stayed too, though Herodotus suggests they were kept more by force than by choice, and that when the final battle came, they would surrender rather than die. And the 300 Spartans, of course, stayed. They stayed because they were Spartans, and it was what Spartans did. They stayed because their law, the law of the mess, the law of the agoge, the law that said you returned with your shield or on it, did not allow them to go. They stayed because Leonidas was still there and a Spartan king led from the front and his men did not leave him. And they stayed, perhaps, because some of them had known since the moment of selection, since the day Leonidas had looked each of them in the eye and confirmed that their children were living and that their family lines would continue, that this was always where the road was going to end. What did they do with the night that remained to them? The ancient sources give us some details, and they are very quiet details, which makes them more affecting than any dramatized version I could construct. They ate. Whatever rations remained were consumed, because there was no point in conserving them. They prepared their equipment. Shields were polished and checked. Spear hafts were inspected for cracks. Armor fittings were tightened. This was not ceremony for its own sake. A damaged piece of equipment in the morning's fighting could mean a faster death, but it also had the quality of ritual, of men doing the things that their hands knew how to do when their minds were turning over things that words could not hold. They dressed their hair. We know this because the Persians had observed it on the first day, and because it was a known Spartan custom before battle. Long hair, combed and arranged, was the mark of a Spartan warrior going to a sacred act. It was how you presented yourself to the god, to the enemy, and to the moment. Did they talk to each other? Almost certainly. These were men who had known each other since childhood, who had eaten together every night for decades, who knew the sound of each other's breathing in darkness from having slept in the same barracks through the cold months of Spartan winters. There would have been conversation, but it would not have been the kind of conversation that we might imagine, dramatic, emotionally expansive, full of declarations. The Spartans were trained against that kind of speech. What they were trained toward was the short sentence that carried its full weight without flourish. We know some of the sayings that were preserved as examples of Spartan laconic speech, that remarkable habit of saying in as few words as possible what other men would have taken a paragraph to convey. When a Persian envoy told the Spartans that their arrows would blot out the sun, a Spartan soldier named Dionysus reportedly responded, "Good. Then we'll fight in the shade." This story may be apocryphal, many such stories are, but its preservation tells us exactly what kind of men these were and what kind of talk they valued. Not denial of the reality they faced. Not false bravado. But a certain kind of dry, absolute refusal to be made smaller by the magnitude of the threat. The sun being blotted out was just weather, and you adapted to weather. What you did not do was run from it. Somewhere in those hours before dawn, Leonidas may have addressed his men. If he did, no speech survives in the ancient sources. What survives is only the decision, the fact of remaining, the fact of the chosen ground, the fact of the morning coming. And then the morning came. Part 9, The Last Battle, the morning of the third day. Leonidas made a decision with the dawn that speaks to something deep in the Spartan military understanding. He did not wait behind the wall. He led his men forward, out beyond the narrowest point of the pass, into the slightly wider ground in front of it. This was an offensive choice, made by a commander who understood that the psychology of a last stand could not be allowed to infect the fighting itself. Men who stand and wait to die, who huddle behind a wall and wait for the end, die badly and often sooner than they need to. Men who attack, who move forward, who take the fight to the enemy, who force the enemy to come to terms with them rather than simply surrounding them, can inflict damage that is entirely out of proportion to their numbers. He wanted to kill as many Persians as possible before the end. This was not revenge. It was not anger. It was strategy of the deepest kind. Make the cost of Greek blood as high as possible, make Xerxes understand through the bodies of his best soldiers that Greece was not a place that would be easily conquered, by the rest of Greece, the fleet at Artemisium, the evacuation of Athens, the preparations for whatever came next, every additional hour that could be purchased with Spartan lives. The Persian assault on the third morning was different from the first 2 days. The Immortals were descending the Anapaea behind the Greek position, and Xerxes knew that time was now working in his favor. He threw everything at the pass, not cautiously, not with any attempt to preserve his soldiers, but with sheer overwhelming force, wave after wave, with orders, according to the ancient sources, that officers behind the front lines had whips to drive their own soldiers forward if they hesitated. The Greeks fought in the wider ground and drove forward with an intensity that cost the Persians dearly. Leonidas fought in the front rank. And in the fighting of the third morning, he was killed. What followed his death was, in the ancient sources, the most violent and focused episode of the entire battle. The Spartans fought over the body of their king with ferocious determination, not for sentimental reasons, or not only for sentimental reasons, but because in Spartan culture and religion, the body of the dead had significance. A king's body abandoned to the enemy was a particular kind of desecration. They fought off Persian attempts to capture or mutilate it, and they managed to recover it and carry it back to the wall. At the wall, the remaining Greeks, however many were still standing, made their final stand. Ancient sources describe them fighting first with their spears, then with their swords when the spears broke, then with their hands and teeth when the swords were gone, against a Persian force that had now closed around them from both the front and the rear as the Immortals arrived from the Anapaea. The Thespians fought to the last man alongside the Spartans. Their 700 dead are recorded by Herodotus in the same passage as the 300 Spartans, and the Thespian dead is a number that the ancient sources preserve without the same level of mythological elaboration as the Spartan 300, but it is just as absolute. The Thebans, as Herodotus records, threw down their weapons and surrendered, claiming they had been held there against their will and were friends of Persia. Xerxes reportedly had them branded, marked as slaves, which suggests some skepticism about their claims on the Persian side as well. The last Spartans died on a small hill, a slight rise within the wider ground, fighting with bare hands and whatever fragments of weapons remained to them. Xerxes sent forward archers and overwhelmed them with missile fire, because no other way had worked. The pass was finally clear. 3 days after the battle had begun, the road to southern Greece lay open. But what the Greeks had bought with those 3 days was not nothing. The Athenian fleet at Artemisium had held the Persian navy to a series of tactical draws over the same 3 days, inflicting losses, preventing the outflanking of the land position, forcing Persian naval commanders to pay a price for every engagement. When the news of Thermopylae's fall reached the fleet, the Greek ships withdrew southward, but they did so intact and with their fighting capacity preserved. The navy that would face Persia at Salamis, the naval battle that would truly decide the outcome of the war, was the same fleet that had fought at Artemisium. Athens was evacuated. The civilian population, men, women, children, crossed to the island of Salamis and to the Peloponnesian coast. An almost empty city was left to the Persian advance. It was burned. The Acropolis was sacked and its temples destroyed. The destruction of Athens was the moment of maximum Persian triumph in the entire campaign. And it was also, in a way, its culminating overreach. Because the Greeks were still fighting. Part 10, Aftermath, Salamis, the Legacy, and what Thermopylae meant. The Battle of Thermopylae was a defeat. Let us be clear about that. The pass fell. The army holding it was destroyed. The road to Athens and beyond lay open, and Xerxes used it. Athens burned. From a purely tactical military perspective, Thermopylae failed in its immediate objective of holding the Persian advance. And yet, what Thermopylae achieved was of a different category than tactical success, and understanding that distinction is essential to understanding why this battle has resonated for 25 centuries. The first thing it achieved was time. 3 days at the pass, 3 days at Artemisium simultaneously, that was the margin of difference between an organized Greek withdrawal and a rout. The Athenian evacuation was completed. The fleet was preserved. The strategic assets of the Greek alliance, its naval power, its capacity to continue fighting, survived because Thermopylae bought the hours needed. The second thing it achieved was a demonstration of what was possible. Before Thermopylae, there was genuine uncertainty throughout Greece about whether resistance to Persia was even viable. The empire had never been defeated by any European force. Its army had swallowed entire civilizations. The very scale of what was coming seemed to argue for the futility of resistance. Thermopylae changed that calculation. Not by winning, but by showing the costs of not winning. 3 days of fighting against the greatest army in the world, by a force a fraction of its size, in which the Greek side killed Persian soldiers in numbers that made Xerxes himself reportedly weep with rage, this was proof that the empire was not invincible. That Greek discipline and Greek equipment and Greek use of terrain could extract a price that even the great king had to pay. The Battle of Salamis, which followed approximately 6 weeks after Thermopylae, proved this point definitively. The Greek fleet, under the strategic genius of Themistocles, lured the Persian navy into the narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the Athenian mainland. In this confined water, exactly as at Thermopylae, the Persian numerical advantage was negated. The Greek triremes, faster, better handled, crewed by trained Athenian sailors, destroyed or disabled a significant portion of the Persian fleet in a single day's fighting. Xerxes watched from a throne on the shore of Attica, just as he had watched from his position above Thermopylae. At Thermopylae, he had sat in frustration watching his best soldiers die in a narrow pass. At Salamis, he watched his fleet disintegrate in narrow water. The parallel is not coincidental. It reflects a Greek strategic understanding of how to fight a larger enemy that runs from the pass at Thermopylae directly to the strait at Salamis. After Salamis, Xerxes withdrew most of his army and navy back to Asia. He left behind a substantial force under his general Mardonius to continue the campaign, but the strategic initiative had shifted irrevocably. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, a Greek land force, with a Spartan corps, destroyed Mardonius' army on the plains of Boeotia and effectively ended the Persian threat to mainland Greece. The Persian Wars were over. Greece had survived. Western civilization, with all its subsequent complexity and achievement and tragedy, would develop without the overlay of Persian imperial control. It is worth pausing here to consider a counterfactual that historians have long debated: what would have happened if Thermopylae had not been held for those 3 days? If the Greek fleet at Artemisium had been outflanked before it could withdraw? If Athens had not been fully evacuated? It is genuinely uncertain whether Salamis could have been fought, or won, under those circumstances. The chain of contingency is long and the outcomes genuinely unpredictable. What we can say is that the 3 days at Thermopylae were not wasted. They were spent with deliberate precision on the most important purchase available: time. The bodies at Thermopylae were buried where they fell. Xerxes, apparently troubled by what he had seen, or perhaps simply anxious to prevent the Greeks from making the battlefield a place of cult veneration, reportedly had the bodies of the Spartans thrown into a pit rather than given proper burial rites. This was, in Greek religious terms, a serious desecration. The treatment of the dead was a matter of enormous moral weight in the ancient Greek world. The denial of burial was understood as a kind of eternal punishment, condemning the spirit to wander without rest. Later, after the Persian army withdrew, the Greeks returned to Thermopylae and gave their dead proper burial. A monument was erected at the site of the last stand, a stone lion, the symbol of courage, and the inscriptions were composed. It was likely the poet Simonides of Ceos who wrote the 2 epitaphs that have come down to us and that remain, 25 centuries later, among the most famous lines in the Greek language. The first epitaph, for all the Greek dead at Thermopylae, read, 4,000 here from Pelops' land against 3 million once did stand. The second, specifically for the Spartans, go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. The second epitaph has been translated in many ways and debated by classicists for generations. There is a version that renders the Spartan word for laws as commands, that here, obedient to their commands, we lie, which places the emphasis on military obedience. There is another that renders it as their orders, suggesting a slightly more mechanistic interpretation. And there is the version that goes simply, here we rest, obeying their traditions. But whatever the precise translation, the essence is consistent: these men died not because they were forced to, not because they had no choice, but because their culture, their training, their understanding of what it meant to be a Spartan demanded it of them. They were obedient to something they had internalized so completely that it was no longer external constraint but internal necessity. The fame of Thermopylae spread rapidly through the Greek world and almost immediately began to acquire mythological dimensions. The story of the 300 became the story that Greeks told each other about who they were, what they were capable of, what their resistance to tyranny, and it was framed explicitly as resistance to tyranny, was worth. The battle was recorded in detail by Herodotus, who was born around the time it was fought and who, in composing his histories, drew on the testimony of survivors, eyewitnesses, and their children. Over the centuries, the story passed through Roman hands. Roman historians and philosophers used Thermopylae as a touchstone for discussions of military virtue and the relationship between the individual and the state. It passed through the Renaissance, when classical learning was revived and the stories of Greece and Rome were rediscovered with passionate intensity. It arrived in the modern era carrying the weight of 25 centuries of interpretation. And it has been used for many purposes in that time, some of them noble and some of them troubling. The image of a small force resisting a much larger one has been applied to conflicts ranging from the genuinely comparable to the deeply inappropriate, and the specific context of the Spartan 300 has sometimes been stripped away in service of political narratives that the original history does not support. It is worth being careful about this, as a historian. Sparta was not a democracy. It was a society built on the exploitation and terror of the Helot population. The Agoge, for all its extraordinary effectiveness in producing warriors, was also a system that created profound human costs, children taken from their families, lives narrowed to a single purpose, the full range of human possibility contracted to the dimensions of the battle line. The 300 Spartans were brave men, and their sacrifice was real and consequential. But we honor them best not by simplifying them into pure symbols of freedom, but by understanding them as products of a specific, complex, deeply strange civilization that had made certain choices about what it valued and what it was willing to sacrifice in service of those values. They valued loyalty. They valued discipline. They valued the collective above the individual. And in that narrow pass, with the Persian army behind them as well as in front of them, and with the dawn coming up over the Aegean, those values produced something that 25 centuries have not managed to forget. The larger Greek world that Thermopylae helped save went on to produce Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. It produced the tragedies of Sophocles and the comedies of Aristophanes. It produced the histories of Thucydides and the geometry of Euclid. It produced the Parthenon. It produced, in short, much of the intellectual and artistic foundation of what we call Western civilization. None of that is the reason the 300 stayed at Thermopylae. They did not stay to preserve Western civilization. They did not think in those terms. They stayed because their law required it, because their king was there, because their brothers were there, because going home without them was not something their entire lives had prepared them to do. But the world that they saved with their 3 days in the past used the time they bought to become something extraordinary. And on the hillside above the Anapeia, where the immortals descended in darkness to seal the fate of the defenders below, there is a silence now that has the quality of very old things. The hot springs still bubble. The mountain above still rises in the same lines it rose in on that morning in 480 BCE. The sea still moves along the coast, though it has receded somewhat over the centuries. The very geography has shifted, the once narrow pass now somewhat wider, as if the landscape itself has tried to forget what it witnessed. But the inscriptions remain, in one form or another. And the story remains. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. Closing meditation. The night is very still now. We have traveled a long way together, From the court of Xerxes to the workshops of Sparta, from the oracle at Delphi to a narrow pass on the eastern coast of Greece where 300 men combed their hair and waited for the morning. What remains with us from stories like this one is not the battle. The battle is over and has been over for a very long time. What remains is something quieter. The image of men who knew what was coming and prepared for it with the same careful attention they would have given to any morning. Men who polished their shields not because it would save them, but because it was right. Men who were obedient, not to a tyrant, not to fear, but to a code they had made their own so completely that it was indistinguishable from who they were. We may not share that code. We may look at Spartan society and see much that was brutal and much that was unjust, and that seeing is honest and necessary. History does not ask us to approve of everything it shows us. But it does sometimes show us, in the most extreme circumstances, something recognizable about the human capacity to choose. To look clearly at a difficult thing, to make a decision, and then to be fully present in that decision without drama or retreat. The 300 chose their ground. And the ground held them. Let your own breath settle now. Let the images of that ancient landscape, the cliffs, the sea, the morning light, grow soft and distant, the way all landscapes do when sleep begins to take you. You are safe. You are somewhere warm and still. The story is complete, and its people have been sleeping for 25 centuries in a pass above the Aegean, where the hot spring still breathes softly into the night air. Rest now. If you're still awake, the battles are over now. Rest easy. Subscribe to Wars and Dusk for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.